Welcome to the Hyphen, Indian American Dialogues. The data is clear. Violence against Indian Americans has increased in the last few years. We also seen rampant online abuse targeting Indians. And the destruction of our temples, of our gurudwaras, and other religious spaces has been targeted. In the last several decades, there has been a significant rise in high skilled immigration from India, particularly amongst the tech communities. While we also see a significant increase in immigrants being targeted by our national government. What explains this rise in anti-Indian hate at this moment? Today, we are joined by an expert to help us unpack why at this moment in time we feel an increase in hatred towards Indian American communities. Manjusha Kulkarni, a civil rights attorney and longtime advocate whose work sits at the intersection of immigration, racial justice, and public policy. She is executive director of AAPI Equity Alliance, where she leads statewide efforts in California to advance equity for Asian Americans and Pacific Islander communities. She is also the co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate. She is recognized as among Time's most influential people, as well as on the Bloomberg 50 list, among many other accolades. We're so delighted to have you join us here, Manju.
Thank you so much, Sheetal. It's a real honor and pleasure for me to be with you.
Well, let's get right into it. You founded this incredible organization called Stop AAPI Hate. It focuses on data. So what is the data on what is happening right now in this moment we're living in terms of the feeling and hatred or discrimination towards Indian Americans?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So, as you mentioned, we co-founded Stop AAPI Hate back in 2020 when we saw the rise of anti-Asian hate. Much of then, it was directed at the East Asian community, related back to the emergence of COVID-19 and the pandemic. And what we're seeing now really is a significant emergence of anti-South Asian and anti-Indian hate more specifically. And we see that in a couple of different places. In the reports that we do with NORC out of University of Chicago, we've done national surveys and found that in the South Asian American and specifically in the Indian American community, close to 50% of community members have said that they have experienced a hate act in the last few years. That's obviously very concerning. And what we're also seeing since 2024 is a real rise in anti-South Asian hate in online extremist spaces. And so with a group called Moonshot, we've been able to track what is that growth. And it's really concerning because actually much of our lives is spent online. So it's no longer sort of real life versus our online lives. But what people are seeing and experiencing is that they are now targets just because of the color of their skin and their nationality.
What do you see that's happening online? So can you talk a little bit about what are the specific messages you're reading and the incidence of them, right? So you say they increased. To what extent have they increased and what are they saying?
Right. Well, what we've seen is 75% increase in the months after Trump's reelection. This directed at Indian Americans, threats of violence specifically increasing 88%. And, to give you an idea of what this looks like in the daily lives of Indian Americans, we had from our reporting center, an individual in Texas who was working at her retail job. Someone came into the store and said, I'm glad Trump is deporting you. Similarly, an individual in Virginia was at a restaurant, a Thai restaurant, and someone came up and said, I'm so glad, Trump is effing with you. Things like that, deporting you, messing with you. These are the kind of reports we're getting regularly from community members. And it's also similarly confirmed by videos that have been posted on YouTube and other places where perpetrators themselves are taking pictures of or video of Indian folks at Costco in their neighborhoods and saying, we need to get rid of these people.
Yeah, it's just it's so sad to hear this, and this isn't the first time this has happened. And of course, as you say, President Trump came on an agenda to an anti-immigrant agenda effectively, and now that has really come to a crescendo with the activities of ICE and the recent killing of a U.S. citizen in Minneapolis. Much of this anti-immigration work is obviously targeted towards undocumented people. And do you feel that Indian Americans are being uniquely targeted for hate, or do you see this across different Asian communities? Because I know a lot of your work you work very much in solidarity with other Asian communities.
Well, unfortunately, we're seeing it across the board. And, what this really is, state directed or government directed animus against our communities. Also, against the Latino and Black community as well. So I wouldn't say it's unique. Where it is particularly different is we are seeing, a particular focus on tech workers, those with H-1B visas. And so, where that wasn't taking place so much before, now, even as of last December, we saw some of that hate increase in these online spaces as a result of what were very public conversations between, say, Vivek Ramaswamy, Elon Musk, and Steve Bannon, and others within the MAGA movement to really highlight, what we think of as very positive contributions in our communities, folks with tech expertise, those, like Sundar Pichai and others, Satya Nadella, who are helping to create jobs at, companies like Google and Microsoft. And yet I think it's because of their visibility and the visibility of the tech industry that we are getting targeted in this unique way.
Yeah, what's interesting is that the Indian population in the US has more than doubled, right, in the last quarter of a century. And as I was looking into this, it turns out that the foreign-born population has increased far more rapidly. So whereas in 2000, 36% were foreign-born, over 50% in 2023 were foreign-born Indians, right, as compared to U.S.-born, which is obviously explained by the rapid H-1B immigration, because most of the beneficiaries of H-1B visas are tech workers and are from India. And so this sudden rise is perhaps one factor in explaining also the resentment that is that we see against this particular community, because as you say, it's sort of targeted in a way. The rhetoric is very much about the recent immigrants who are in the tech industry. How does that resonate with you?
Absolutely. But what we've seen time and time again in American history is where there is already economic anxiety, or that economic anxiety can be ginned up. by those who oppose immigration. They then target and scapegoat individuals of Asian descent. So we saw this with the Chinese Exclusion Act in the late 1800s, when, you know, those from China were sought, and they worked on the transcontinental railroad, providing so much in the way of contributions to the United States. Then in the early 1900s, because Chinese were excluded, Indians were then targeted. And we saw that in, your state in Bellingham, Washington, where individuals, 200 Indians were driven out by 500 white men because they were working in the lumber mill. And then that was part of a movement that led to the Asiatic Barred Zone Act after the 1965 Immigration Act that enabled so many of our families to come to the United States. After, more than 50 years of exclusion, my own family and others experienced discrimination. When my mom went in for a job interview to work as a family practitioner at a local hospital, the white male interview panel said to her, with really only one question, "Why do you foreigners come to the US and take all of our jobs?" So this is a repeated pattern, unfortunately. And so we should understand it as such so that we can learn from it and we can know what tools to use in order to fight it.
Yeah, so I think that's a very important point that you raised about the history. This is not new, and there are many points where this has happened. Particularly the last two, also that I wanted to add. You sort of went back to early immigration history in the U.S., right? There's also in where I grew up, and around the time I was a high school student in New York and New Jersey, this episode of a hate group called Busters, which focused specifically on Hindu women with the idea of with violence and murders committed in the late 80s. And I think that what also around that time, there was a huge population increase in Jersey City, right? It used to be Jackson Heights, which is where my parents moved when they moved here. And then the locus of Indian community became Edison in the East Coast in New Jersey. And so I think there's a growth and then there's a backlash, right? And which is how you saw, which is where you traced to the Chinese and early Asian communities. So, but I'm also wondering, how do we make, what can we learn from those as you're trying to do, which is there's one factor, which is when the community grows in size, they perhaps attract more attention. When there's economic insecurity, as you say, they attract more attention because, for example, when my parents came here in the 1960s, as possibly yours, our community is also diverse, right? We have a lot of taxi drivers, but nobody's saying, "Wow, you taxi drivers, you're taking our jobs," right? It's focused very specifically on community, on groups of people that are doing well. So it seems to be those factors seem to be important, as you say, and as and the climate, right? The political climate that we're living in right now, which helps to unravel this Pandora's box or opens it up and allows for this kind of behavior. Does that resonate with you, or what do you think about the all of those factors as being helpful explanations?
Absolutely. We think of it as sort of a trifecta. What you see and hear from not only President Trump, but those in the MAGA movement, Stephen Miller, Steve Bannon, and others, is the xenophobic rhetoric. You then see policies put into place, whether it's executive orders, immigration policies directed at our communities just in this week, there have now been, there's a new policy against providing visas to those number of South Asian countries, including Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan. So while it may not be India, it's our brothers and sisters in neighboring countries. And it's that same type of policy against H-1B visa holders, and even efforts to prevent truck drivers from getting commercial licenses, right? So we are seeing that here, in
We've had these
California.
horrible episodes, right, of undocumented Indian truck drivers getting into massive accidents, and so
Right. Well, certainly, I mean, I think that people point to that. And I think, but again, what is driving it? We see it's the rhetoric, the policies, and then the individual hate acts as well. And what's different about what's happening now, Sheetal, versus even a few years ago, is that often those people who make the remarks, they now have the ability to call ICE or Border Patrol, right? We saw that against the Korean community in Georgia, where a woman who was part of the MAGA movement called ICE on individuals who are here legally, who are working at the Hyundai plant. So folks in our communities are rightfully scared. They're very nervous. They're anxious about what's going on. And I think it speaks to now what we need to do as a community to fight back.
so with that, what are your thoughts? How do we fight back? How do we convince others that this is not okay?
Well, we at Stop AAPI Hate have, essentially 4 strategies that we use: data and research, to make people aware of what is happening against our communities so that they're well informed. We have, individual community safety strategies in terms of know your rights and other pieces, narrative change and communication. So again, we make it clear to folks what exactly those threats are, where they're coming from, and then the policy and advocacy piece. And part of policy and advocacy is not just at the congressional level or federal level or state levels, but even electorally. What can people do? So many of those in our community are US citizens, and they have a very useful tool, which is voting. And being civically engaged. And I think 2026 is a key moment for them to become engaged if they haven't been already, because we need to vote. We need to make our voices heard. And this is not simply about anti-Indian hate. This is about fighting authoritarianism, fighting against a continuation of efforts to really bring about racialized terror against our communities and other people of color.
Well, I really appreciate everything that you all are doing, and all of those strategies seem to be important and needed to work sort of in coordination with each other. One of the things that I wanted to also explore with you is the idea of our success and how that might lead to backlash, and this might go to the narrative change, right? We, as we should, have celebrated the incredible success we've had as a community, being one of the highest median, household income, the highest household income of any community in U.S. is Indian Americans, as many people know. Reports have been published. People have celebrated their religion, built these incredible, statues, have public gatherings, celebrate Diwali in Times Square. All of that, I think, we ought to be able to do. But has all of that, unfortunately, contributed to some feeling of resentment and negativity, along with all the other contextual factors that we talked about being present?
Right. Well, there's no doubt. I mean, I want to be absolutely clear that we should be able to celebrate our accomplishments. And, every year we contribute to $750 billion into the American economy, over 11 million jobs that have been created, partly due to, folks who are in various sectors, not only tech, but also engineering, medicine, business, academia. And so, absolutely, we should celebrate that. But we do know that often that visibility then turns, in some quarters, then to hate, where people have a white supremacist agenda or a lens. They then use that and weaponize our success against us, right? I think with each community, there's a different sort of iteration and strategy to weaponize hate. So, where people, significant numbers of community members are undocumented, then white supremacists point to that, point to their lack of status, right? Where many in our community are doing well financially, they point to that. So it doesn't really make a difference as to whether we are financially successful, whether we contribute or not. Cab drivers, truck drivers, caregivers also contribute, as do migrant farm workers, and those who work in factories. So I think no matter what it is, they will find a way. That is, people with a white supremacist America First agenda. And it's become very, very apparent with President Trump when he points to places like Norway and Sweden. He is looking for an anglicized, slash white, pure, a pure nation of only white individuals. And that couldn't be made more clear than the fact that the only refugees being accepted now are those Afrikaners from South Africa, whose forefathers and foremothers actually engaged in apartheid in many cases.
Yeah, absolutely. The vision of America as a nation for white people and composed of white people is what's driving the anti-immigrant sentiment for all across America, right? Not just for Indian Americans. One other you had mentioned, look, Indian Americans contribute 350 billion or whatever the number is to the American economy, in particular with the work we do, right? What about the philanthropic contributions? I think there's what I appreciate is that there's slowly more increasingly Indian Americans being active in politics, in civic organizations. And I think doing more of that helps us to build bridges with other communities so that we are not seen as sort of isolationists or seen as people who are getting money from the US, but giving it to India and not giving back here. So I think those are long-term critical factors, in my view, that the community needs to focus on, not simply to avert this kind of situation we're in now, but just generally because, to me, that's the right thing to do.
There's no question of that. And we have seen tremendous progress on the political front with, Zohran Mamdani now being mayor of, the largest city in the United States. And I think he has done a really nice job in his campaign in uplifting the experiences of immigrant communities, South Asian American communities, and including that of his own mother, who is a very well respected Indian filmmaker. And we see that around the country with Congress members Pramila Jayapal, Ro Khanna, Ami Bera, Raja Krishnamurthy, who's now running for Senate, and so many others. Similarly, at state and local levels, there is, Ghazala Hashmi, who just won the lieutenant governor's race in Virginia. And now we're seeing in this election cycle, I know here in Los Angeles, we have a couple of different candidates running for city attorney and for city council. We already have one city council member, Nithya Raman, who is Indian American in Los Angeles. So I think absolutely civic engagement is key. And it's a way for us to be involved. This is for, thousands, actually millions now of immigrant Indians. This is their home. For many of us, we were born here. So I think, there's no question that we can contribute, we should contribute, and that is going to be a meaningful way forward for us to raise our voice about the policies and the priorities that our community members have, and how we want to see this country move forward.
Well, as we wrap up, I'm curious to imagine what the future looks like, right? We do have, at least 3 years left with our present administration. We don't know what the next administration will do or will be. We know that there's likely to be fewer immigrants from India coming, particularly given that H-1Bs have been made expensive with the $100,000 fee. We do know that there will be efforts made to remove the undocumented people who are here, much of which has grown in the last several years, and we also know that the pathways for citizenship of our existing tech H-1B workers is very long, given the country-based green cards, right? So the line for the Indians is super long. So it's very possible that we see a retraction in the Indian population, and quite frankly, many people don't even voluntarily want to come here. We see in the university, the student world, people have choices. They can go to Canada, they can go to Australia, where they're going to be treated better and going to be more welcome. So it's very possible we see a retraction in our community. And then I also wonder, what that means, how you think the future is for how we're treated in this country.
That's a great question. And I do want to share that we at Stop AAPI Hate have recently done an international student survey, speaking with, a number of students who hail from South Asia, and they say they are very nervous about their current prospects. They don't feel that they've been made safe or that they're being protected by their universities. In fact, one student, we quoted as saying, run away from the US, telling prospective new students not to consider this country for their higher studies. So obviously that's very concerning, as are the policies every single day that we're seeing from this administration. But, what I am hopeful about is it's clear to me that a majority of Americans do not support these policies. They do not support ICE going door to door and terrorizing people. They don't believe in kidnappings and disappearing of people from our streets, from our schools, from our grocery stores. And so that's what makes it so incumbent upon us. We have the power right now to change what's happening. We are not in a static situation at all. And we've seen that where we fight back, we can and do win in many cases. And so there is a live opportunity right now for us to stand alongside our Latino, Black, and other AAPI sisters and brothers, along with our friends in white communities, our neighbors, our family members, and to resist what's happening. We know that in past cases, we've been resilient. When this has happened in Bellingham, when this has happened to our communities after 9/11, when so many of us were attacked, when we were scapegoated. So we know that we can be successful against these efforts. And what brought so many of us here to the US is the values of equity, fairness, justice. And if we uphold those values alongside other citizens and residents of the United States, I firmly believe we can be successful, and that, it will not be a retrenchment, certainly not a permanent one, but an expansion of our community, and even more importantly, the opportunities for us and our children to thrive.
Thank you so much for that hopeful conclusion and hopeful note. And I very much hope the same. Really, really appreciate you being here, Manju.
Well, thank you so much. It's really great to speak with you. And please know that our organization is here. We're here to support our community. And I encourage folks to join in that fight, because, again, I'm confident that together we absolutely can win.
Yeah, and thank you so much for all the work you do. The Stop API Hate is an incredible organization, plus many, many other things you're doing. So as a community, we're so grateful to people like you.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode of The Hyphen, please like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. I want to thank our producers, Ashani Jagtiani, Shannon Young, and Social Sherpa for their incredible work, as well as our media partner, India Abroad.